So I said choreography matters. There are a couple of sample choreographies that are available to think about. One that has been promoted by Barry Smith, who is here with us this week, is to begin the process by entering communities and getting them to identify their current vulnerabilities, assess what their current management issues are, and then estimate those changes and risks with climate change. So climate science as an entry point enters here, but social science as an entry point enters here, and also here when you begin to assess adaptive capacity for future risks and identify modifications to manage them. But in this model, the conversation begins by going into a community and asking them to talk about something they have already experienced. It's not model dependent, it's observation dependent. Tell us what you've seen in your community and tell us how it's affected you. Now, an alternative to this is something I call the scenario first approach, where the first thing you do when you walk into a community is to show them some indicator of the future and ask them, what difference does this make to your vision of the future? Does this matter to you as someone who runs an irrigation district, as someone who runs a city sewage system, as someone who's looking at long-term regional development plan? Does this matter to you? So here the first step is identifying the scenario-based impact. You estimate a projected change in risk compared to the risk you know about today, and you identify the vulnerability change. Not the vulnerability today, but the vulnerability change. Again, climate science enters into all of these steps, and social science enters into these steps. You then go to the assess adaptive capacity step and identify modification management. There's similarities and differences to these things, but the first step in the dance changes. Now, where you do what is going to depend on what the experience has been in those places. It may be very important to start with vulnerabilities if this community has had no experience with climate change before. But if you've been to a place previously, or if you know colleagues have been, or they've had some experience with climate change studies because, say, the UN has been there, or national government has been there, if they've already heard about some of this and seen some of this, they may be quite ready to plunge into a scenario first choreography. But this is a decision that has to be made on the basis of what knowledge you have about the community now. Philippa Shepard and others published a paper a couple of years ago that talked about context. And this was in relation to work in the Okanagan that was part of research that I'd been leading for a number of years. What she pointed out was a couple of, I think, very important things. Any place you go, climate change isn't going to operate in a vacuum. It's going to interact with other stressors. It's going to be important to see whether local actors see any kind of signal already. Are they engaged in this now? Is there a champion for proactive adaptation to a predicted risk? Decision process needs to be accounted for, and that means it's not just the actors, but it's the values and it's the local networks as well. I mean, what is on the ground right now in terms of the decision making that occurs in a place? What are the barriers to that kind of decision making? What are the enabling factors? The economic, the legal, the institutional aspects of this, the perception aspects of this. This is not climate science. This is about a whole lot of other things, which we need to get engaged in this as early as possible. And what experience have they had previously with adaptation to a stress coming from outside? Any pre-adaptation and post-adaptation data available? Maybe they weren't reacting to climate change, they were reacting to some other kind of stress, but is there a record that says, okay, we know how well this worked. We can present it to you. The change in metering, the change in a dam size, the change in zoning. We can tell you how well this worked. Were adaptation benefits saved or were they spent on something else? And what are the implications that this has for any scenario-based assessment? In the information flow between climate science and decision makers, and I just showed this slide to a meeting of meteorologists last week, which a couple of you were at. There's been this tendency in institutions like that for a long time that says if we can reduce uncertainty in the physical science and just lay it out there, people will magically take it and make decisions. It's kind of what might be called a simple outreach information flow between those that produce climate information and the stakeholders that are responsible for making decisions. What I've argued for a while is that if we think of the information flow between climate science and professionals who work for stakeholders, that information flow requires going through this series of filters or mediums. The tools they use in their design, management, and operational work. Whether it's hydrographs, crop models, malarious models, decision support tools, there's a whole lot of things in here. And what they're looking for is information that helps them do specific things. Risk assessment, design standards, operating rules, allocations. So there's a delivery process and there's a translation process. It's not outreach. It's a different kind of process. If you combine those two, you end up with a series of these kinds of information flows. Here's the flow between information and the filters, the flow between the filters and the practitioners, complemented by direct outreach between these two, as well as the outreach to the stakeholders. But if all of these things are operating, something else occurs. At least I believe something else occurs, and that is practitioners now become more engaged as extension agents, and they have a different conversation. Theirs is as extension agents to the governments and the institutions they work for, and there's a more direct conversation about policy issues between those governments back to them. As a scientist, it's very unlikely that I'm going to be part of this. And the same will be true with my other scientist colleagues, because they're working out here, and hopefully they're working in here. The extension agents are working in here. You know, just like Al Gore is busy training all these people to deliver a slideshow. I think if we collectively are able to create extension agents, and perhaps some of you who are in this room may be in this box, this conversation can be a way to bring climate science into the decision-making realm. Slowly, incrementally, but in a professional manner, and one which ensures that the practitioner issues are properly dealt with. Issues like best practice, liability, and being able to pass this on in a rigorous way to the next generation of practitioners. Again, things that are going to be very difficult for people in here to initiate on their own. So building the science policy bridge is going to involve this kind of dialogue. This is the Penticton Dam, which controls the flow out of Okanagan Lake southward into the rest of the Okanagan watershed. This fellow here works for the provincial government. His name is Brian Simons. At the time of this photo was taken, he was a flood control officer. We had him engaged in this study on climate change and water management in the Okanagan. The Okanagan Valley is just east of here, about 8,000 square kilometers. It's experiencing very rapid population growth. In 2003, during the drought, the city of Summerlin was in a water crisis and they had to cut off some users. Already, you have a region where most of the streams are fully licensed. They are not allowed to put another license onto that stream. I'm not saying the 2003 drought was because of climate change, but climate change added on to the existing water stress is going to create some issues. Now last week to the meteorologists, I was asked to give a talk called How Do You Get Climate Science into Decision Making and linked to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. So I showed this slide, which begins with this dialogue and this initial display of a climate change impact, which is a hydrograph showing how the stream flow peak, which today occurs in May, will in the future occur earlier, more flow in the winter, less in the summer. It changes the whole seasonal cycle of water. That began another set of analyses to talk about changes in risk between water supply and water demand, that as we move through the scenario, more and more of these years will show up in this upper left corner of the diagram: high demand, low supply, greater risk. At the same time, we had a consulting engineer do an inventory of past, present, and planned infrastructure, water management activities, both dams, meters, education programs, to determine how much water could be saved or spent and what the costs would be. So being able to combine those things led a local planner to put climate change into a local water management plan. This is the Trepanier Landscape Unit Plan. Trepanier is just west of Kelowna. So that is a plan that now has climate change in it. All of that led to a much wider dialogue within the Okanagan on how climate change would affect water management, which led us to be able to create a new group-based model exercise. This lady here, Stacey Langsdale, is a PhD student who recently graduated, and she created a decision support model with the help of local practitioners, irrigators, engineers, municipal planners, Okanagan First Nations, BC Fruit Growers Association, that helped her build this model. This model created diagrams like this, showing how under dry years, supply reduction and demand increase would create major problems. And this yellow bit, which shows how demand could be reduced by residential adaptation, is not enough to stop that dry year water shortage. And if you were to solve the problem by putting all of your pipes in Okanagan Lake, the farmers would get the water they need, but the lake level would start to take a hit. So you can't solve your problem by sticking your pipes in the lake. This kind of conversation led the leaders of the water chapter in the 4th assessment report to specifically ask me to send them a text box to include in the water chapter. So from Trout Creek to the IPCC, this is an 8-year journey that involved a shared learning experience that enabled us to create extension agents in the region so that they